Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Glad to have you at another edition of Art Brunch. Want to make a quick announcement for you. We have a new art exhibit up here at the Off-Broadway Gallery at Pine Street Church. So in case you happen to be a person who is in the Colorado Front Range area, I'd like to invite you to the opening exhibit for the artist Adderley Grant Lord. Her exhibit, Black Futures in Art, Excellence Beneath My Feet, Lives Within My Bones, is a part of a larger citywide exhibit called Black Futures in Art. Her particular opening is going to be on Saturday, February 7th from 4 to 8. I'd love to see you here at the Off-Broadway Gallery here in Boulder. Again, that's Saturday, February 7th for the opening reception. There'll be a special artist talk on the themes of the citywide exhibit. That'll be on February 12th from 5 to 8. So please, if you happen to be in the area, show up. Love to see you. All right, we're going to start a new series. Didn't quite know how to title it. This is a very early title. Uh, it's I've named it Our Shared Traditions, and this is part one. It'll probably be a four-part series. I put a bunch of question marks there because I think in the current political climate, we doubt that we share any traditions the way we're bickering. I want to begin with a quote. For now we see through a glass darkly. This is from the Christian scriptures from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now there is a founding father of this nation whose philosophy embodied this passage about as well as any historical figure that I can think of. I'm speaking of Benjamin Franklin, whose political philosophy rested upon a single profound conviction: the necessity of compromise. The necessity of compromise. Franklin understood what we so often forget, that human imperfection makes absolute consensus impossible. Franklin played the pivotal role in producing the American Constitution. And Franklin knew that a perfect document could never be achieved by any gathering of mortal minds and imperfect people. And so in his famous closing address at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he stood before his fellow delegates and spoke truths we desperately need to hear again. He spoke of the inevitability of human error. You see, when you assemble people for their joint wisdom, he said, you also inevitably assemble their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. So, being that as it may, how could we expect then a perfect production from such an assembly? So he urged humility and self-doubt. Imagine if our politicians today had a spirit of humility and self-doubt in their debates. Franklin said, doubt a little of his own infallibility when he was speaking to his fellow delegates. As he grew older, Franklin admitted that he found himself changing his mind on matters he once thought certain. And so he learned to value the judgment of others more than his own. And then, and this is my favorite, he offered them the carpenter's analogy. During those heated debates over representation, Franklin said, quote, when a broad table is to be made and the edges of the planks do not fit, the artist takes a little from both and makes a good joint. Both sides, he insisted, must part with some of their demands to join together in common purpose. So Franklin was a pragmatist, not an idealist. And here's what I must say plainly. Today's political climate stands in direct opposition to Franklin's spirit. It is not pragmatic. Both parties seem led by ideologues and tribalists who care less about the principles they claim to champion than about defeating the despised other. And to bolster their arguments, they promote myths, myths that have little basis in the actual history of this nation. I hear things like, oh, if we could just go back to the way it was, say in the 1950s, or like it was in the 1880s even. But these were not actually golden ages, at least for most Americans of the time. And to say they were is complete fabrication. Now, that being said, myths are essential for national unity. Nations are held together not by laws alone, but by stories. Held together by stories. Stories that explain why difference exists, how conflict is managed and endured, and what future together is imagined is worth saving. In moments like ours, when the cultural fabric seems to tear, the stories a society tells about itself matter more than ever. Consider the dominant American myths that we have inherited. American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, the melting pot. Each of these myths, I believe, has reached its limit. Each presumes either moral innocence or inevitable progress or cultural assimilation. And none of them adequately describe the historical reality of how this nation was formed. American exceptionalism whispers to us that our nation operates outside the moral constraints that bind other nations, that our founding was uniquely virtuous, that our trajectory is uniquely blessed from on high, that our actions at home and abroad then are incontestable. But is this really true? Manifest destiny told our ancestors that expansion was divinely ordained, inevitable. But this myth erased, deliberately erased, the violence and dispossession that actually characterized westward movement. It made conquest seem like providence. And the melting pot? This myth demands that our differences dissolve into sameness, that immigrant and indigenous cultures surrender their particularity to a dominant Anglo-Protestant norm. Become like us, it says, or remain forever outside, worthy of our prejudice and discrimination. Well, none of these myths can sustain us in a pluralistic society. None provides a credible framework for the world we actually inhabit, where difference does not dissolve, where moral complexity cannot be denied, where progress is neither inevitable nor uniform. But listen, friends, 18th century America offers us something very different, a different kind of myth altogether. I call it the myth of the negotiated marriage of unequals. Let me say that again. The myth of the negotiated marriage of unequals. A covenantal story in which a shared identity emerges not from our sameness, but from the ongoing, often painful negotiation of our differences. This is a myth that happens to conform to actual history. It embodies Benjamin Franklin's requirement of a pragmatic spirit. So this is not a myth that promises harmony and romantic bliss. It is a myth that demands endurance. It acknowledges that the American project is fundamentally incomplete, that unity must be continually renegotiated rather than simply inherited or assumed. Think about this. America's deepest unifying myth may not be one of harmony achieved, but of cohabitation sustained, like a real marriage. And where has this truth been preserved? Well, partially in art, in visual art. which has given form to this paradox, expressing both the tensions and the fragile hope embedded in our experiment. Where political rhetoric obscures the contradictions in our history, visual culture has preserved it. Where nationalist narratives impose false coherence, art reveals the fractures. Much of the visual archive offers not a heroic American story, but an honest one. Let me take you back to the eve of the American Revolution. The colonies were among the most culturally diverse societies on earth. On earth. English settlers provided political scaffolding, yes, but they did not dominate uniformly. Germans in Pennsylvania brought distinct religious traditions. The Scotch-Irish shaped Appalachian culture. Africans brought in chains, transformed Southern economies, while struggling to maintain fragments of ancestral cultures against their systematic erasure. And indigenous peoples, decimated by disease, pushed from their lands, they nevertheless remained integral to colonial life as trading partners, military allies, cultural influences, and contested neighbors. The truth is, we were more divided at the founding of our nation than we are now. The result was not a melting pot. It was a heated and volatile home. Italian Americans despised Irish Americans. Irish Americans despised African Americans. And Anglo-Saxon Americans despised all of them. And yet somehow they agreed that whatever their differences, these would be settled through political process, however messy, because such a process was better than war. It was better than a divorce. Now, the American Civil War was the great moment that taught us this lesson. Now, in the year 1776, there was no unified American culture. There was a provisional arrangement among peoples who disagreed on nearly everything except this, that continued cohabitation was preferable to renewed violence. And the artists of the time, they rarely depicted this complexity directly, but it did surface obliquely, powerfully, in images of land, labor, and encounter. Look now at Benjamin West's The Death of General Wolfe. This was painted in 1770. At the time, there was no United States of America. We were simply a British colony. Now, at first glance, this painting is nationalist propaganda. It's a celebration of British imperial triumph. The general dies Christ-like. Notice his posture. Dies Christ-like at the composition center, surrounded by officers arranged like apostles around a fallen Savior. But look closer. See that Native American figure seated at the lower left? He observes the scene with calm detachment. He's neither a mourner nor some celebrant. He's simply a witness to what's happening. His presence asks questions the painting cannot answer. Whose victory is this actually? Whose land are we really standing on? And what's going to come after imperial triumph? Now, Benjamin West painted this in London, and he painted it for British audiences. But it also circulated widely in America, where viewers read it very differently, not as imperial celebration, but as an acknowledgement that American identity would have to be negotiated among peoples with incomplete and incompatible claims to the same territory. Now consider John White's very early Algonquin watercolors. These are from the 1580s and 1590s, extremely early. These images circulated widely through colonial imagination. Villages, ceremonies, farming practices depicted with careful ethnographic attention. They are simultaneously respectful, but also distancing. They acknowledge indigenous sophistication while framing it as subject matter for imperial knowledge production. Evidence to be collected, data to be cataloged. These images remind us that America's beginning was always already multicultural and always already morally compromised. Early settlers may have admired native peoples, but they also feared them, and they desperately wanted their lands. And then there is Edward Hicks, a Quaker preacher with no formal training in art, who painted the Peaceable Kingdom series over 60 times between the 1820s and 1840s. Drawing on Isaiah's prophecy, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, Hicks showed docile animals coexisting, while in the background, William Penn negotiates peacefully with the Lenape Indians. The peaceful but very brief beginning of a negotiated marriage of unequals. Now, this painting is mythical, but not entirely divorced from actual history. But it is, above all, an aspirational work of art. Edward Hicks knew that the Pennsylvania he inhabited was built on infidelity, on broken treaties and continuing dispossession. His repeated return to this image suggests not naive optimism, but desperate longing, an early visual articulation of the negotiated marriage as a spiritual ideal that will never become an historical fact unless we continue to negotiate our differences while always aspiring to ever-broadening ethical perspectives. Now, hear this carefully. What distinguishes the American marital myth from older national myths, say from Europe, is that it does not require unanimity. French identity presumes cultural continuity stretching back centuries. German identity assumed ethnic cohesion. British identity relied on monarchical loyalty. The American experiment could depend on none of these myths. We had to forge unity among people with no shared ancestry, no common religion, no unified culture, no historical memory of collective belonging. So how was this possible? Well, the solution isn't very glamorous. It was procedural rather than substantive. The Enlightenment ideals of liberty, representation, and rights function more like a framework for argument rather than some ideal that we must fully realize. Our heated debates did not require agreement, just that we agree to stick around, to continue having such debates. A Calvinist and a deist could both invoke natural rights while meaning entirely different things. A slaveholder and an abolitionist could both appeal to liberty while advocating opposing policies. Friends, this is the stark truth of the negotiated, heated marriage myth that I'm proposing. The genius of American political discourse was not that it resolved these contradictions. The genius was that it allowed them to coexist within a structure that promised continued debate, continued negotiation, that because of the marital covenant, we promised one another to continue the argument. Let's look now at John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence. This was painted in 1818. This painting has become so iconic that we actually misread it. We assume that this painting depicts the actual signing of the Declaration of Independence. It does not. It shows an earlier moment. It shows the presentation of the draft of the Declaration of Independence to Congress. And this detail is important. The five-man drafting committee stands before John Hancock, offering the document not to be signed, but only for consideration and debate. This is the myth made visible. America is founded not on violence alone, but on argument, negotiation, heated debate. The assembled figures in this work are not going to agree. Some of them are leaning forward in attention, others leaning back in skepticism, still others turn away in conversation. The document is not yet law. It is a proposal, subject to debate, amendment, even rejection. Trumbull painted this 4 decades after the actual event, when the revolution had been mythologized into an inevitable triumph. And yet the artist chose to depict not the moment of consensus, but the moment of deliberation. This painting depicts a covenant, not a contract. What binds Americans together is not our shared conclusions, but the shared willingness to remain in conversation, no matter how difficult. George Caleb Bingham offers us an even less idealized vision in The County Election, painted in 1852. Here is a democratic participation as it actually occurs. Messy, deeply imperfect. Voters line up at the courthouse steps. One man is being helped to the polling place, or is he being dragged there drunk? Another is counting coins, suggesting vote buying. There are children playing underfoot. Men argue, men persuade, men negotiate. The scene here is neither heroic nor degraded. It's simply the way it actually works. Bingham tells us the truth. Democracy is not pure ceremony, conducted by virtuous citizens in dignified settings. It is negotiated in public space among, listen to this, among unequal actors with mixed motives. And yet Americans continue to participate in the Republican process. The myth of democratic purity would exclude most of these figures. The myth of the negotiated marriage of unequals includes all of them. Norman Rockwell's freedom of speech created during World War II shows us a lone working class man standing to speak at a New England town meeting. His hands are rather rough looking, his jacket worn. The seated figures around him are better dressed, more comfortable, and yet they all listen. The power of this image lies in its assertion that belonging does not require refinement, education, wealth, or social standing. It requires only the courage to speak and the community's willingness to listen. The negotiated marriage survives precisely because it does not demand virtue or sophistication, only presence, only our voice. This is the minimum requirement of the covenant. Not that everyone will prevail, but that everyone may speak. Well, now it's time to speak a hard truth. The American marital covenant was never negotiated on equal terms. To acknowledge the myth of the negotiated marriage is not to absolve America's founding violence, enslavement, displacement, economic coercion. These structured participation from the beginning. Indigenous peoples were systematically excluded, treated as obstacles to removal rather than partners in deliberation. Enslaved Africans were denied all standing as political actors. Women were barred from formal participation. Working class whites traded political voice for economic subordination. And yet, even here, the myth persists, not as total forgiveness, but as a moral tension. The gap between our promises and our practices generates the central moral dynamic of American history, the ongoing struggle to expand the circle of participation, to make the negotiation less forced, the family home less exclusive. Winslow Homer's The Gulf Stream, painted in 1899, shows us what exclusion looks like. A black sailor alone in a damaged boat. The mast is broken. Sharks circling in turbulent waters. On the horizon, barely visible, a ship sails away. Storm clouds gather. This image resists every form of heroic resolution. There is no rescue approaching, no divine light breaking through, no suggestion that courage will overcome circumstance. Now, Homer painted this 3 decades after emancipation, when Reconstruction had collapsed into Jim Crow, when Black Americans found themselves formally free but systematically excluded from economic opportunity and political power. The sailor's isolation is not accidental, it's structural, and Homer refuses to pretend otherwise. Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series, 60 panels depicting the great migration of Southern Blacks to northern cities, shows us that movement itself becomes a negotiation, sometimes a violent one. This is not movement toward harmony. It is movement toward another heated negotiation. And yet the family home expands geographically from southern fields to northern factories, and tension travels with it. This panel shows violence between northern workers and new challenges from Black migrant workers. New cities bring new forms of exclusion, new struggles for housing and employment, new confrontations over space and resources, new demands for recognition. That being said, all peoples of the Americas seem to find strength and common ground in their faith traditions. Faith, including skepticism as a child of the Enlightenment, has always been a strong force in the family compound of America. Faith, at least partly, has unified and sustained all communities, city or rural, whites, blacks, people of all ethnic backgrounds. Well, let me begin to bring this to a close. America's unifying myth is not a promise of harmony, of marital bliss like we see in the perfect TV family. It is not a memory of innocence. It is not a guarantee of justice. It is a covenant, fragile, repeatedly violated, continually renewed, among people who do not agree on origins, meanings, or ultimate ends, and yet continue to inhabit a shared and contested space and a shared and contested future. It is a marriage of unequals who promise, whether in sickness or in health, to continue negotiating our differences without divorcing one another. The marriage myth is not glorious. It does not inspire the way myths of noble founding can inspire. It is difficult work, often frustrating, and frequently unjust. But it is deeply and importantly human. It acknowledges what other national myths often deny, that unity must be built one argument at a time, that our differences will not dissolve, that conflict cannot be permanently resolved, that the work of creating common life among uncommon peoples is never finished. The American experiment is still in process. In fact, it is the ongoing process that makes it American. This is what American visual culture has quietly preserved, even when political rhetoric denied it. That America is not a nation of people who agree, but a nation of people who argue and who have chosen, however imperfectly, to keep arguing rather than to split apart. In that choice, fragile and compromised as it is, lies whatever hope the American experiment might still offer the world. Despite the volatile nature of the current political climate, it's my hope that our myth gives us the courage to keep our covenant intact.